Claremont School of Theology. Thank you for your presentation. I'm wondering, doesn't the rhetoric of human rights risk the very intoxication with our own assumptions and projecting our claims as universal that you want to avoid? And if not, how does a universal claim like human rights avoid those particularist projections?
Well, that's that's a very valid question and important one. And this is, it raises the same type of issues that I struggled with, in that every time we say a human right, it's like raising even the idea of God's self. As a Muslim, every time I say God, I am thinking of my relationship with God, but I'm also, there's a risk that I will be also referring to everyone else's relationship with God. This is a little bit of a tangent, but I can't resist since I'm here. In when I first came to the United States, I was completely green. I had never been to the States before, never been to anywhere before, and at Yale, I got ill, and there was a nurse, a very kind nurse at the health services at Yale that was very, very nice to me, and then eventually invited me to dinner at her house to meet her husband. And her husband was studying at Yale Divinity School. And then after dinner, they asked me if I would go listen to an inspirational speaker with them. And after I listened to the inspirational speaker, they asked the speaker to come talk to me. And yes, you guessed it, the inspirational speaker was an evangelist. I don't even remember his name, but he's one of the ones back in '82 you saw on TV all the time. And the whole ride home was how I should wake up and accept Jesus Christ in my life and stop being a Muslim and so on. And I kept thinking of how the beauty of their initial act of healthcare, of being kind to someone coming from Egypt alone without his family, 19 years old, clueless, had ulcerative colitis, which is a serious illness, and how ugly the scene of an entrapped attempt at conversion is. And that is a risk, the same type, parallel risk of, every time you use a lofty idea, you fall into the danger, the risk of leveraging that lofty idea in a way that is beyond you and beyond your being and what your being represents. And when you extend your being in that fashion, it tends to drift into godforsaken lands. But to answer your question specifically about human rights, isn't human rights in itself an arrogant concept? Well, it depends. If you mean by human rights that human beings must recognize as their own for them to be effective, then yes, it's an arrogant concept because it ignores their own recognition. But if you mean by human rights, which is what I mean by it, it's not dependent on their recognition, it's not dependent on instruments of international law, it's not dependent on what their countries negotiated or not negotiated. Human rights is an act of grace, meaning even if you don't recognize yourself as having that right, I extend it to you as an out of respect and out of my own, an extension of my own consciousness and my sense of duty. So, for instance, even if you don't know that you need to take this medicine, I will offer it to you. I won't force you to take it, because then I've denied you of another human right, and that is your right to harm yourself if you wish. Although, taking your own life can be debated morally, but I'm one of those who believes you even have a right to take your own life if you want. Similarly, my obligation, and this comes with a mountain of Islamic theological theological tradition and arguments and so on, is that my obligation is to present the good and offer it. I can't get you to drink the water to stay hydrated. I mean, I drink Diet Coke all the time. Everyone that loves me, I had a heart attack a couple of months ago, and everyone that loves me says, no more Diet Coke, you should drink water. Now, by offering the water, they've respected my human rights. That's it. I mean, and they've upheld the principle of human rights by saying, I feel for you, and I offer it. But at the same time, if anyone dares to take away my Coke, or force me to drink the water, they violated my human rights, and they have fallen into a paradox and a contradiction and ultimately hypocrisy. And that is whether people accept it or not, you offer it. And like faith itself, you can only invite. Once you start compelling people to go beyond the invitation and say, I will not feed you unless you convert, or if you don't convert, we'll stop talking to you, or if you don't convert, I will take away your privileges, or I won't fund your college, or I won't pay for your bills, or whatever it is. We've moved into a state of the antithesis of grace and the antithesis of faith, in my opinion.
Thank you. I don't see anyone at the mic. Please.
You talked about the confusion that often happens between civil rights and human rights, or civic rights. But I wasn't quite sure how those are supposed to relate, or how they do relate in the world today. Is that some civil rights supposed to be moving more towards human rights, or what's the vision, I guess, is my question.
Well, the confusion is just carelessness in the way we use the terminology. Often, for instance, people are thinking about the American Bill of Rights, and they instead of saying they recognize civil rights in the United States, they assume that the American Bill of Rights are human rights. This might be or might not be, but it cannot be assumed, because civic rights are rights that are produced by either an actual or hypothetical consensus of society. Involves terminology and overlapping consensus. In the opinion of some other tradition, a conversion consensus. Others, whether like this, the hypothetical social contract that at some point, or even a philosophical consensus, like both Rousseau and Ibn Tufayl. Ibn Tufayl, by the way, his work has been translated to English. If you haven't read him, you should, because if we lived in a world of greater balance of power, he would be as famous as Rousseau, at least. Ibn Tufayl imagines that people a guy finds himself alone in an island. It reminds me of that show. What is it called? Huh? No. That's you're so young. I'm talking about people who are to stone ages like myself.
Gilligan's Island?
Yeah, Gilligan's Island. So the guy finds himself alone in the island, and then he goes around the island. He finally finds a community, and then able to find imagines very much like the Rousseau. What this community they start talking about what are the rules that we should agree on for us to avoid killing each other, for us to avoid and then able to find walks you through a lot of things like they realize that some of them have shelter, and some of them when it rains, and some of them don't, and then they say, well, can we come to some type of consensus? Can we exchange, blah, 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 and so on and so forth. And then Abou El Fadl uses this to then bring in the idea of, then one of them turns out to be a prophet, and then that's when it really gets interesting in Abou El Fadl's writings. But those people on the island, those Gilligan Island people, what the rules they agreed on, to the extent they agreed to respect certain rights, these are civic rights. Human rights they don't require an agreement. They exist at the time this person was on the island by himself with no other. He, just by being a human, he was going around with this package of rights that do not depend on anyone recognizing them, anyone negotiating them. They are, because as our forefathers in the US said, these are inherent and undeniable. And of course, the philosophical question that you always get into, well, where do these rights come from? That's a different issue, but and I don't think it's philosophically as interesting as all the professors who write about it, because I think that can be justified with far less writing than philosophers of natural rights put in. I mean, they'll write 1,000 pages to justify it, and I think, anyway. So, but that's a critical distinction between the two. And human rights, as I said, that's why I started out by saying that it's like a state of grace or a state of light, a state of divinity. The divine hasn't forced us to believe in the divine. The divine hasn't compelled us to, if God would have wanted, God could have created us all Christian or Muslim or all whatever, or all white, or all short, or all tall. But the fact that the divine didn't, the God didn't, in itself, it speaks volumes. And it is, for me, the genesis of my human rights, the beginning of my human rights analysis.
Well, I have a practical question. It is, in the U.S., we have this tradition of human rights, which came from the Puritan Revolution and the Puritans on one hand, but on the other hand, from, say, Thomas Jefferson and the more enlightened tradition. It comes from several sources, but anyhow, it's here. I mean, it's in the preamble of the Constitution, Declaration of Independence. It's in Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King, and so on. My question is the more really just practical, down-to-earth question. How has that worked for Muslims in the United States? Has it helped? Has it not helped at all? Or what?
I mean, I would tell you that any Muslim who believes it hasn't helped, then they should promptly go live in a place that doesn't recognize human rights. mean, I'm not saying this to force them or to exclude them, but that would be genuinely my advice to them. For the simple reason that there are so many Muslims that, like myself, who ended up in the United States because of the fact that it offers the liberties that it does. And my conviction is that this package of liberties are not offered by the United States as a gift, but my conviction is that as a matter of faith, these liberties are given to me by God.
Yes.
And through the faith that I have internalized, and we find this, by the way, in the Islamic tradition itself. I spent a good part of, I received my doctorate from, as you said, from Princeton, which is sort of a bastion of Orientalist thought. And one of the big Orientalists in Princeton is Bernard Lewis. You send my greetings to him. But Bernard Lewis, I remember, wrote in a book called Political Language of Islam that Muslims, as a matter of normative values, as a matter of faith and conviction, cannot live in a place where they do not control or dominate. I wrote an article about a study of juristic and theological debates and discourses on Muslim minorities throughout throughout really human history, that showed that, to say the least, Bernard Lewis was simply projecting a normative belief that he held for whatever personal reasons onto something that it was a complete fantastical construction. It was, and in fact, what you find is that the theological and legal discourses among Muslims was constantly as to whether something is part of the abode of Islam or not part of the abode of Islam. They would call it what would translate as a legalistic category. Something shari, anyway, skipping but basically a legalistic category. But beyond that, theologians would say, okay, then we must talk about what is Dar al-Adl, the abode of justice. What is Dar al-Iman, the abode of true faith. What is the Dar al-Salam, as opposed to Islam, the abode of true peace. And consistently, because the relationship between rulers and theologians and jurists was not always wonderful and so on, there are many theologians, especially those who ended up persecuted by the state, that would say, well, yes, the ruler rules the part of the abode of Islam, but the area that the ruler rules is not an abode of justice, or is not an abode of peace, Dar Salam, or is not an abode of al-haq. Is actually another huge kind of the abode of truth. And what is fascinating is it focused around a tradition attributed to the Prophet. Depending on your belief, you either believe that the Prophet actually said it or didn't say it, in which the Prophet is reported to have said, the Prophet Muhammad, reported to have said that God will give victory to an unbelieving just faction over a believing unjust faction. That if you are just, and although you're not believers, God will give you the upper hand over people who are believers, but you don't have justice. This was in turn the basis for a variety of theologians from Hassan al-Basri to someone like Mullah Sadra to, in more modern age, someone like Kawakibi and Tahtawi and Muhammad Abdu, and that basically, like Tahtawi best represents us when he goes and visits France. He is so impressed by France, and he comes back to Egypt, and they ask him about France. This was before, of course, the invention of airplanes and all of that. This was right before World War I. And Rafat Tahtawi says, in France, I saw Islam, but I didn't see any Muslims. While in Egypt, I see Muslims, but I don't see Islam. And basically what he's referring to is that old theological debate about, I was so impressed by the state of justice, or state of, in his case, state of cleanliness. He was very impressed by how clean the streets are. He was also impressed by, apparently he loved French poetry. And so all of that to him represented the true embodiment of Islam. And so all of this is to say that for many Muslims, and I'm one of them, for us, the United States is more metaphysically an embodiment of Islamicity or Islamicness or Islamic normativity than Saudi Arabia, for instance, which in my view doesn't embody any Islamic normativity. I mean, I feel as alien as me on the planet of Mars when I go there. Now, of course, it's relative. There are things in which I disagree and don't like in the United States because I think they're fundamentally unfair, like the fact that we have so many people that are homeless and we just go on our merry way and we just pass by them and just as if it's not our problem. Or the fact that we spend an enormous amount of money on weapons, but we don't even come close to fighting the endemic and serious problem we have with human trafficking, and especially trafficking of children for sexual purposes and child pornography. I mean, it keeps me awake at night when I think of, and because to me, if we would bring an end to child pornography and to human trafficking, and for me that is a fulfillment of my Islamic being as much as my moral being, as much as my human being, because of the suffering that I've seen people endure because of these practices. Now, does this mean that I think the United States is bad? Absolutely not. In fact, I mean, it's in always degrees of justice, or in my language, degrees of beauty, or degrees of divinity, or degrees of justice, or degrees of grace. The United States, in the degrees of divinity, in not political divinity, not the king and state and church and so on, but in metaphysical divinity, in transcendental reality, it is closer to divinity than a country like Saudi Arabia, which has an enormous amount of injustices and human suffering on a daily basis. And that's not, these types of ideas, they're not popular in the media. In fact, all the times I've been interviewed, I can't tell you that I actually remember, I once did a whole program, I taped a whole hour. What was the name of that show that I taped and then they never broadcasted it?
So many.
The one where Leslie was saying, "Oh, this was amazing, this was wonderful." You actually go through, and ultimately it's not broadcasted because it's not what the media wants a Muslim to be saying, and that's a serious problem. I mean, and a problem that, from my perspective, a person of true faith would help a person like myself overcome, not celebrate, not be happy about, and not in any way support. In the same way that the people on the Commission for Religious Freedom that suppressed any evidence of persecution against Muslims, to me, they betrayed, from my perspective, they betrayed their own faith before betraying me, and they betrayed their own relationship with God before betraying me.
Thank you so much. I want to just give you possibility to ask one more question. If not, I think we really want to thank you so much, Dr. Abou El Fadl. Really appreciate your presence here and what you share with us. We also wish you good health and pray for you so that you will continue to have all this energy to share and this amazing knowledge, and hope also that we will have other opportunities to actually be together like that. And thank you very, very much. Really appreciate it. And tomorrow night at 7, there is the last session of the week. So you're welcome to come tomorrow at 7.
Thank you so much.
I really very much. I read your books, and so it was a really great joy to have you here with us.
Writing is so much better because you get a chance to set it out.
Thank you very much.